He is the most left-wing leader Labour's had for 60 years. The elements of his programme which enthused and inspired so many, ending the waste of billions on Trident, free education at university level, capping rents, council house building, end to austerity, public ownership, rail, energy and so on, were the themes of the meetings he did around the country, tens of thousands of whom people attended those meetings, and that's all the positives. And if you forgive me, in some of the headlines by which I have to talk in a relatively short contribution, the positives which enthused tens if not hundreds of thousands of people to vote for him, representing the anti-austerity hopes of millions of people outside, can only be delivered if certain conditions are met. And the first problem that he has is that 90% of the Parliamentary Labour Party didn't support him. 96% of councillors in Britain didn't endorse him before the election. There's 7,000 councillors, Labour councillors in Britain, only 450 endorsed him before the election. And we're seeing during the Labour conference and in recent days what that's meant to some of the policy issues he raised during the leadership election and how they're now translating into more modest versions of what he originally put forward. Now, it doesn't mean the scale of his victory at the right wing are going away. The press will keep up their sniping and attacks, and we've seen it from the gender balance of the shadow cabinet through to whether he wears a tie or not, whether he sings the national anthem at the Battle of Britain commemoration and so on. Perhaps the most interesting was, as you would expect in the Daily Express, they managed to find out that in 1867 his great-great-great-grandfather ran a workhouse, and according to the Lancet, the doctor's journal of the day, was not a particularly good boss in that workhouse. They'll find things to try and undermine him, but it'll be a relatively slow process in the sense that it's not as it could have been. It would have been a much narrower result. There could have been legal challenges and all sorts of things. The number of people who were ruled out from being able to take part, which included senior trade union figures like Mark Sawotka, the General Secretary of PCS, was not allowed to cast a vote in the election. There could have been some legal... I think the scale of the victory which Jeremy got means that it's more likely to be an imprisonment from within the Parliamentary Labour Party, the undermining from the right-wing members of the shadow cabinet, as I'll go on to give illustrations in a moment, and a hope that his position of authority will be eroded. And the reason for that is simply this. The establishment in Britain have invested so much in the last 20 or 30 years in creating a pro-big business Labour Party. Remember that when Margaret Thatcher was asked what was her most enduring legacy, it was Tony Blair and the creation of New Labour, the continuation of the Thatcher pro-market, pro-business policies of the 70s and the 80s into the subsequent period. And the establishment are not going to give that up easily. So we've even had, relevant to the 1960s and early 70s with Harold Wilson, this unnamed general, talking about if Corbyn actually became Prime Minister, and all sorts of events could take place to try sabotage the elected Prime Minister. There are only 100 generals in the British Army. It cannot be impossible to find out which one was talking to the Sunday Times. Whether or not a drone strike takes place or not, we'll have to wait and see. But the winning of the election, in my view, was the easy bit. The hard bit, given the minority position within the constitutional framework of the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the councils, the bureaucratic machine of the Labour Party itself, the hard bit is breaking out of that and continuing the momentum which Jeremy built during the leadership election to actually deliver on some of the campaign promises itself. Now, looking around the room, apart from one or two of us who are just approaching the age of 50, most of the comrades under 35 or 40 will not know that there ever was anything like a left within the Labour Party. If you've grown up with Blair and Brown and Miliband and the like, why would you know anything different to that? But go back to the period just after the Second World War and remember this then as what a Labour Party has been in the past. In 1946, the Labour government nationalised the Bank of England and civil aviation. In 1947, coal mining, the railways, road haulage, canals and cable and wireless. In 1948, all electricity generation and gas. in 1951. Steel, in a 6-year period, 20% of the British economy was taken over by the then Labour government. And measured against that, the promises which Jeremy has so far made, which already, as I say, are having to be reined back on as the days go by, are modest. That's not to say that under different circumstances in the weeks and months ahead, they could be strengthened. But just look at what started off as renationalisation of rail. Clear promise throughout the election campaign. When it came to the Labour Party conference this week, and that was actually put forward in more precise terms, it is as each private franchise currently run by Virgin or whoever runs out, instead of it going back out to tender to another private company, it would be taken back into the Treasury or the Department of Transport itself. That is estimated to take at least 15 years from a Labour government coming in 2020. In other words, public ownership of rail then gets pushed back to 2035. Then abolition of free schools and academies. Now, according to Lucy Powell, the education spokesman, means that local authorities could interfere or instigate an investigation into specific schools, not that local authorities would get back the control which existed prior to the academisation programme, which was accelerated under Tony Blair. Nationalisation of energy, which was a clear one. I mean, the examples were given of the £8 billion profit the energy companies made a couple of years ago, and the choice so many people have to make in the winter between food and fuel and so on, and the need for public ownership of energy. This week, Lisa Nandy, the energy spokesman, said that what Labour is now talking about is creating in each local community a sustainable energy provider who would then compete with the 6 big energy companies. Now, I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but the biggest polluter in Europe, certainly in Britain, but probably in Europe as well, is Drax Power Station in Yorkshire. It makes hundreds of millions of pounds in profit, deciding which particular fossil fuel it's going to run the most of its energy production from. That's not going to be competed out of existence by small-scale, local community-based energy alternatives. The only way to deal with things like climate change and the fossil fuel misuse that's leading to climate change is by proper public ownership of energy production, and then a public debate of how do you get sustainable and safe, clean forms of energy put in its place. So those are examples, regretfully, of things where the hopes that Jeremy raised during the election campaign, because of this preponderance of the right wing within the parliamentary Labour Party, it's coming back on. And the other one, of course, is the banking system, the system which, under its gambling speculation 7 or 8 years ago, triggered the economic recession that we've lived through over the last 7 or 8 years, is now spoken of in Labour terms as being solved by having meaningful regulation of the banking industry instead of the public ownership which John McDonnell in particular has spent many years saying was necessary. Now, to break through that, the current framework and constitution of the Labour Party has to be smashed. Labour was founded 115 years ago as a federal organisation between the unions and socialist parties and socialist societies. 18 years later, it had individual membership when it adopted the Clause 4, Part 4, that part of its constitution which committed itself to a new socialist society based on public ownership in 1918. When it was founded, it was a federal organisation of unions and socialist societies. And something like that is going to be necessary, in our view, if Jeremy's going to be able to break away from the way in which the changes that Tony Blair brought in from 1994, which weren't just ideological, weren't just scrapping the socialist aims of Labour and replacing them with a homage to the market and to competition. They were also structural, also organisational. 20 years ago, a new member of the Labour Party, like the hundreds and tens of thousands that have joined in recent weeks, would have gone to a local branch meeting called a ward meeting, could have initiated a debate, got a decision of that ward, it would go up to a town or city meeting, it would go to the conference, you could change the whole policy of the Labour Party in that way. It doesn't work like that at all anymore. There were no debates at the Labour Party conference the last 5 days. The only way a debate could take place is if the Constitutional Arrangements Committee accepted an emergency had arisen. And they tried it with Trident, and it was turned down on the grounds there was no emergency. There was no, all you got at the conference was a succession of shadow cabinet spokespersons coming and putting their point of view. Policy now is made by a hand-picked thing called the National Policy Forum, which was set up well before Jeremy was elected. So he's the prisoner of something that's a couple of years old there. The National Executive Committee is also pre the Corbyn era. So the organisational structures of Labour are not conducive to him being able to change that. And the first major test I think he's going to face is, because there's already effectively two Labour parties in existence. There's the Jeremy Corbyn with its 350,000 supporters Labour Party, and then there's the Parliamentary Labour Party, the councillors, the bureaucratic machine. I've been asked loads of times, am I going to rejoin the Labour Party? And I said, well, you know, Jeremy may lead the National Labour Party, but we haven't got a Corbyn-led Labour Party in Coventry. We've got 41 Labour councillors who are currently behind closed doors, though things have started to leak out this week, literally in the last few hours, are preparing another £55 million worth of cuts in local public services in Coventry. Every library, every children's centre, every community centre, every family centre, every adult education centre, all 26 of them, every public toilet, every lollipop man and woman in the city, another 1,000 council jobs, £55 million over the next 3 years. Now, what do you do, even if you think Jeremy is an excellent leader of the Labour Party, when you've got people standing for election next May with that as a programme of cuts? So the Labour Party that people have joined in the inspirational speeches that Jeremy have given us on is not the Labour Party on the grounds in many, if not most parts of Britain today. When asked, would I rejoin, my first test will be, there's a handful of councillors in cities in Britain, in Southampton, in Warrington, in Hull, in Leicester, who voted against cuts on Labour authorities, and they've been expelled by the Labour Party. Southampton, there were two Unite members who were councillors who were expelled from the Labour Party for voting against the closure of a swimming pool in the area that they represent. The first people Jeremy Corbyn should show a difference from the way the Labour Party is to invite back into Labour Party membership those councillors who voted against the cuts, and then say to the rest of the councillors he wants them to follow their lead, bringing all Labour councillors in the country together in a united front with a new programme whereby, instead of when George Osborne will say again in November, another £10 billion to come off essential public spending, Labour councillors identifying in their areas the needs of their communities, adding together what is needed by working class families in those areas, and then bidding to the government for the money in order to provide those needs, and working together with other Labour councillors around the country to provide a united front against Cameron and Osborne. Now, if that was the process that was taking place, then you could engage with that. In fact, Tusk, the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, which was started 5 years ago by the late Bob Crow, then the General Secretary of the Transport Union, the RMT, and involves the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and some leading national figures from a range of unions, from the Fire Brigades Union to the prison officers, from the NUT to PCS, and so on. We had a conference last Saturday, and we are writing to all 2,500 Labour candidates or councillors in next May's elections, saying, do you belong to the Labour Party that Jeremy hinted at during his elections, where he said he wanted councils to stand together against the Tory cuts, or are you planning millions of pounds worth of cuts in local people's services? If you belong to the first Labour Party, we look forward to working with you in anti-austerity work. If you belong to that second Labour Party, Tusk, which stood over 600 council candidates in this year's May elections, will stand widely again in the elections next May itself. So there are two Labour parties produced by this event, Jeremy and John, 300,000 supporters, and then there's the other led by the right wing within the Labour Party, the shadow cabinet and others themselves. It's worth noting, by the way, that although I said at the very beginning that 57% of those who cast a vote from a trade union affiliated membership basis voted for Jeremy Corbyn, the process by which the role of the unions in the Labour Party has been decreased in the last 20 years is extremely sharp. In 1994, when Tony Blair was elected, 800,000 trade unions cast a vote in that ballot. In 2010, when Ed Miliband was elected, 270,000 trade unionists cast a ballot. When they gave the results on the 12th of September of Jeremy's victory, only 70,000 trade unionists took part in that ballot. Less than 10% of those who took place 20 years earlier. And where there has been attempts to change the Labour Party in the past, my union Unite, for example, 4 years ago, had a December Executive Council meeting, brought out a new political strategy, said we want 5,000 Unite members to join the Labour Party and begin the process of change. I remember writing at the time, 50,000 you might stand a chance, 5,000 is nothing. They reviewed it 12 months later, and in December 2012, only 600 Unite members had joined the Labour Party following that appeal from the national leadership. 84 of them were oil refinery workers up in the Grangemouth oil refinery in Scotland. They'd been recruited by the convener of Unite in the oil refinery, who happened to be the chair of Unite in Scotland, Stevie Deans. And when Eric Joyce, the then Labour MP, went berserk in the House of Commons bar, hitting people, and the Labour Party decided he'd gone too far and they had to replace him, there was in Falkirk West a reselection for the next MP, and that's where the Grangemouth oil refinery is. And because 84 workers had paid the full price to join the Labour Party, not just £3, Ed Miliband called in the police, accused Stevie Dean of criminal activities. He lost his job at the refinery, and the process of that was a thing called the Collins Report, which means that in the next 4 years, every last vestige of the federal arrangement by which the trade unions, which by the way over the last 30 years have given the Labour Party £1/3 billion of their members' money to sustain the Labour Party during a period when that 30 years, at the end of which working people had less employment rights, less rights to organise, to strike, to stand up and defend themselves than 100 years previously when the Labour Party itself was founded. £1/3 billion. By 2020 there will be no rights for federal organisation of the unions in the Labour Party itself. And Jeremy's got to get grips with that. That's the arena which is his only salvation. It's ideological. It's holding the line on socialist policies which he's inspired people with. But in order to deliver those as policies, even within the current Labour Party structures, he needs more mates. When I was in the Parliamentary Labour Party, what was called the campaign group, the hard left in Parliament, had 35 members. There are now 9 in the campaign group. John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, and 7 mates. Now, he's not going to be able, in a Parliamentary Labour Party of 232 MPs, to impose the sort of socialism he wants to change the Labour Party with, unless the structures of the Labour Party itself changes. Now, to finish, I just want to bring a couple of other brief areas in. Firstly, what's happened with Jeremy is a symptom. He was modest enough, and I think honest enough, to say that there was a general anti-austerity mood out there amongst people, particularly young people, waiting for something to latch onto, and he became the thing that it was it latched onto. And in that sense, it's not too dissimilar to the process that led to the SNP wiping out Labour in Scotland, with its left of centre anti-austerity programme in the run-up to the election, notwithstanding the fact, of course, it's carrying out Osborne's cuts just as well as the other councils up and down the country have done. Or UKIP in England, tapping into an anti-establishment, all MPs are the same type of mood and getting 4 million votes. Or the Greens getting 1 million votes, but again, an anti-austerity mood. All those things are symptoms, but in Spain with Podemos, in Greece with Syriza, in America with Bernie Sanders and Sharma Sawant, there is a mood of distrust, of establishment politics, and of big business, and the gap between the rich and the rest, which has in the last 20 or 30 years grown so wide. And Jeremy, as I say, is the inheritor of that, and he's attracted wide-ranging numbers of people. And I think, particularly amongst the young, probably most of them think of themselves as anti-austerity. Some may think of themselves as even anti-capitalist. But not necessarily yet do all those people who joined the Labour Party think of themselves as socialists, as having a conscious idea of how society could be changed and how gains for working people could be maintained. Now, Jeremy's put those ideas on the agenda by the way in which he's raised things during the election. But to achieve even the modest reforms which he's put forward and to guarantee and maintain them in the future requires more than just meaningful regulation of a banking system or competition from a publicly community-owned energy provider against the giants of the 6 energy companies. It requires the ability for working class people to actually plan the wealth of this country so it's spent on their needs, not on the needs of the of the rich. This is the 5th richest country on the planet. Whilst we've been suffering the last 7 years of austerity, the top 1% in Britain have seen their wealth double to nearly £550 billion. 1,000 families in Britain have seen every 4 weeks of the last 7 years a £2.3 billion increase in their wealth. £2.3 billion is nearly 3 years of all the food banks in Britain paying 1 million people a week the food to keep themselves going. 1,000 families had an increase in 4 weeks of what's spent in nearly 3 years on all food banks in Britain. Now, rich individuals and corporations are evading or avoiding £120 billion a year in taxation. Deloitte, the accountancy firm, a couple of years ago issued a report that said the largest corporations in Britain now have cash reserves, unallocated cash reserves they could spend on anything, of £750 billion. They don't invest it in things because with wages being held down, with pension costs going up, with pension ages being pushed further and further away, working class people aren't in the same position to be able to buy back all the things from society which their wealth has created that they would wish to. So why do you invest billions of pounds into something which can't guarantee you a profit? But the hundreds of billions of pounds which exist within the society would mean that everybody could have a decent life. The idea of a job which is well paid, leading on to retirement which is comfortable, a free education when you go to university, a home to live in and bring a family up, all those things are entirely possible in the Britain of today, even with the funds that exist at the moment. But the problem is you cannot plan that wealth to deliver those things unless you control that wealth, and you don't control it unless you own it. And that's why public ownership of the main levers of the economy, the giant companies, the banks, the pension companies, the insurance companies, would be essential to guarantee the things that working people need. Now, to finish, one of the epithets thrown at Jeremy during this campaign is that he was living in the 1970s, or wanted to take people back to the 1970s. And in economic terms, I wouldn't mind that. Because in 1973, Britain was one of the most equal countries on the planet. In Victoria's times, back into the 19th century, less than 50% of the wealth that's created in Britain in any one year went to the wages of working class people and their families. Because of the strength of the unions in the post-war period, got up to 13 million members in Britain, the fact that there was an expansion in the economy, that you had a difference between Labour and Tory, you had those nationalisations and public ownership things I mentioned early on. By the mid-1970s, the percentage of wealth created in Britain every year, which went to the working class in terms of wages, had risen to 63%. That difference between 50% and 63% is what gave us the National Health Service, gave us millions of council houses, gave us free comprehensive education. In today's terms, if the proportion of wages received by the working class as a percentage of the wealth of Britain in any one year was the same today as it was in 1973, we would be £250 billion a year better off spread amongst working class people. That's got to be £5,000 or £10,000 per family per year, easily better than we are at the moment. And of course, seeing that raise in working class share of the economy, when Thatcher came to power and her 4 sons, Major, Blair, Brown and Cameron, were put in place to reverse that procedure, and they've had success. The TUC now says we're almost back to that Victorian figure of 50% of the wealth created in Britain going to the working class and the rest going to the rich disproportionately to the top 1% itself. And that's where even the most modest demands that Jeremy puts forward open a crack, open a door that people will not only just see through and think that's not a bad idea, but begin to raise the question, why do we live in such a rich world when insecurity, lack of long-term employment, the costs of £50,000 or £60,000 of going to a university and so on are expected for working class families to pay, whilst a tiny sliver of 1% at the top of society have that life of luxury. So the victory for Jeremy has inspired hundreds of thousands. But what remains, and this is literally the sentence I want to finish on, what remains is that in order to achieve those gains, we have to learn one or two lessons. This is where you get the chance to develop this point because I haven't got time to do so. But when you're looking from Chile in the 1970s through to Greece at the beginning of this year, one of the iron lessons of history is that if the working class takes half a step forward and tries to take a quarter of something away from the rich, but doesn't empower itself with the ability to get the whole of what it's after, then tragedy can ensue. That's the lesson of Greece. The inspiration of Cyprus and Syriza in January of this year, but not taking public ownership of the banks to insulate the Greek economy and the Greek working class living standards against what the EU Troika was intent on doing, meant that by the time the election took place a few days ago in Greece, although Cyprus still won, it was on an extremely low turnout. There was a level now of disillusionment and a rise of the far right with Golden Dawn and so on. Now, things won't follow exactly the same way in this country. But if Jeremy, having inspired people of what change is possible, doesn't have the levers to be able to give and guarantee that change, then disillusionment can set in the future here as well. And we've already got far-right organisations like UKIP standing in the wings, waiting to make of that. So it remains the job of socialists, particularly ourselves in the Socialist Party, to show that fundamental change, a socialist world, certainly is possible, but provided we have a full, rounded socialist programme that recognises the power within the economy, the political power within society, and is determined enough to build a mass force capable of achieving that. Thanks for listening. The first one, which I think I'd like to comment on, is Carmel's point that there's been a normalisation of socialist ideas and particularly economic ideas over the last 3 or 4 months, which wouldn't have otherwise taken place. I mean, just cast your mind back to before 10 seconds separated Andrew Smith from Oxford, giving Jeremy the 35th nomination, meaning there was a left-wing candidate, to the fact that Andy Burnham was portrayed as the left candidate amongst the other 3, who launched his campaign in the headquarters of an accountancy firm in London, who had just been found guilty and fined $10 million in America for hiding the fraud in Lehman Brothers, which had led to the 2007 crash taking place. That's Ernst & Young, the accountancy firm. And the first speech that he made on TV, which I watched, was where he boasted that when, as Financial Secretary to the Treasury under Gordon Brown as Prime Minister and Alistair Darling as Chancellor, his proposals for the budgets of the last couple of years of the Labour government had won praise from David Cameron and from George Osborne because of their financial stringency. He then went on to say that entrepreneurs should be seen just as much as heroes in British society as nurses are. That would have been the left-wing candidate in the election if Jeremy hadn't stood. Now what you have, let's just take away the garbage from the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, but in the Financial Times, the Times, the Telegraph and other serious programmes and papers, there's actually debate about what is public ownership. How should it come? How fast should it go? You know, serious questions and so on. And that can only be to the benefit because the language of what is socialism, what is possible, how quickly and so on, which in many of our formative years in the 70s and the 80s was not just common in academic circles, in universities and so on, but was at certain times quite common down the pub. I mean, during the miners' strike, during the Liverpool battles, there were pubs in many towns and cities in the UK where serious debates about socialist ideas was common currency around a table. And to a certain extent, that's been brought back in the last few weeks by that popularisation, and that is certainly welcome. The second part of that same point, though, is that modest though much of what Jeremy and John McDonnell are putting forward is, it has its echoes in the policies that were put forward by a larger group called the Tribune Group in the 1970s. Now, Pat Wall, who was another militant supporting Member of Parliament, along with a comrade called Ray Apps from Brighton, moved, if I remember rightly, in 1971, a motion that was passed at the Labour Party conference which committed Labour to public ownership of the top 25 companies in the country, so sector of the economy by sector. And they began a debate in the 70s with Marxism on the one side saying you've got to own the levers of economic power if you're going to get anywhere, and Tribune with its alternative economic strategy effectively saying, and I do paraphrase, and therefore I do them a little bit of a disservice, but mainly saying, no, regulation will do. You don't have to actually own things, it's how they're organised and regulated. And the classic example of that was a thing called planning agreements. It was not only putting one or two workers on the board of companies, which had been popularised in Germany through a thing called Mittelspringen, the workers' co-determination, which is still in existence in a lot of big firms in Germany. For example, you see about a quarter or a third of the board of directors of Volkswagen are trade union nominees, so we won't go too far down that road. But the debate, therefore, that took place within the Labour Party when socialists like ourselves were members of the Labour Party were on serious economic issues, and books and pamphlets were written, meetings took place. And with the possible exception of some of the comrades in some of the more senior positions in our trade union activity, most of us since 1992, outside of the Labour Party, have not had those debates. And I think there's a generation of socialists grown up, and it's not our fault or their fault, it's the way in which, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Stalinism, with the triumphalism of Blair and the rest of the neoliberal politicians who took social democratic parties and moved them rapidly to the right, and so it became basically all the parties are big business with an overlapping agenda, and they're baddies, and we're against them. And there was now, as society moves forward, particularly moves forward into conflict, into crisis, and so on, other ideas will rise up and gain quite popular support, with which at the moment we haven't had the experience of arguing the pros and cons against. And one of the really good things about it, I think, is it will force us to look back at our own economic and political education and say, how do you actually say that regulation of the banks is insufficient and public ownership is necessary? Because all we had to do in the past was just point at these bastard bankers and say, if people ran them, they'd be better. And now there's something coming in the middle of that, which we have to start to deal with. And I think, as organised socialists, whatever the outcome, one of the big benefits we're getting from Jeremy and John being in this position is it changes the nature of debate and makes it more serious and so on that we have to to deal with. I was going to also mention the point that when you said about the personnel attacks and so on, there was a famous independent Marxist and Socialist MP at the time of the First World War called Victor Grayson. Long story about how he sort of disappeared and went off the rails and so on. One of his famous aphorisms was, never apologise, your friends don't need it, your enemies won't believe it. And there's an element of that when it comes to the personal attacks, that by dignifying the attacks that you were making, it's not going to change them, and your friends don't need it. They need to hear the positive case why you want to see a change. And from what I hear of Bodrick's campaign, that's clearly what is happening. The last point then was this thing about quantitative easing. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to try and give an economic treatise about it, but just the overview. Firstly, we've had quite a lot of it in the last 6 years. Some £375 billion was found by the Bank of England down the back of its sofa. I mean, we find a quid down the back of our sofa, but they found £375 billion that apparently didn't exist before, which they then used to buy bad debts, toxic debts, off banks, and turn what had been a private debt because of gambling speculation into a public liability. So it changed the responsibility as to who was to dealing with that to make it a public responsibility. Now, what Richard Murphy has been arguing and I think this figure has come from him, or it's come from somebody around him, is that if instead of using that money to buy up the bank's toxic debt, that had been written off and dealt with in some other way, and that money had been spent on the population of the UK, it would be the equivalent of £24,000 for each and every family in the country. That's effectively the debt we've now taken on board because of the way in which that printed money was dealt with. The real effect it had was by shoring up the banks and taking off them their bad debts, it restored artificially and quicker than otherwise would have taken place the value of assets which those banks had. And the people who own and hold those assets tend to be the top 1% of society. So that's part of the reason why the wealth of the top 1% has doubled to £550 billion over the last 7 years, because of the undershoring, the underpinning of policies such as quantitative easing. There was a programme by the BBC on in January called The Rich, or The Super Rich and Us, and its first 5 minutes explained that from 2007 to today, if you add up all the cuts in local authority and other devolved spending, the wage freezes in the public sector, the additional pension costs, the decline in pension payouts, the extension of pension retirement entitlement ages and so on, you add all that together, all the austerity that the government has brought forward, and it's worth about £80 billion. If you add up the bonuses paid to the top of the banking, finance, pension and insurance industry over that same 7-year period, it's the same £80 billion. So the strategy under the coalition government, whether it be quantitative easing, restoring asset values owned by the top 1%, or working class people and our families bearing the brunt of austerity so that the bonuses could continue in the banking sector, both of which could be stopped with two things. One is, if money is to be spent by the state which does not yet exist, it ought to be spent on socially useful things. And there's a hint of that in Jeremy's programme. He talks about a national investment bank making decisions to do that. But if it's to be controlled, back to my earlier point, it can only be done if banking, pensions and insurance are publicly owned. And again, I use this parallel that in the post-war period, looking back on the ill health of the previous 20 or 30 years, the government set up in the mid-1940s a National Health Service. If we nationalise banking, pension and insurance, should have the intention of setting up a National Wealth Service. In other words, the wealth which working people didn't actually keep for their own personal consumption at this time, but they wanted to put to one side for their old age, or to buy a house, or to give to their kids, or what have you. In other words, that almost like deferred wages argument should be held publicly and never used for the gambling and speculation which was used to trigger this particular crisis. Now, those are areas, therefore, where the inspiration which Jeremy Corbyn's campaign has begun to open doors, begun to make that crack, legitimising socialist economics and socialist ideas, showing us that we need to start thinking how better to answer those ideas, because they will develop a certain material force within society if they get large numbers of people supporting them. But the only way in which we're going to be able to do that is the point that was being made by Kevin at the end, is by organisation. We can't be commentators on this. We can't just stand to one side and try and look at and analyse what's taking place. We have to be able to offer, particularly younger people coming into political ideas for the first time, an organisation which is open, which is welcoming, which is one which they feel they can make a contribution, that their voice will be heard and that their ideas will be taken seriously. And if we collectively then work together, it's exactly the same as it's in the trade union movement, it applies politically as well, then we can take steps to ensure that working class people become the authors of their own future, not at the beck and call of that 1%, that tiny number of people, 1,000 families in this country who earn a greater amount of wealth every 4 weeks than we collectively are spending every 2 or 3 years on all the food banks that a million people now in Britain are relying on. That is a country which is top down. A tiny number of people at the top, the vast number of ordinary people at the bottom. And if there's a saying from history I'd like to bring back into more current use, it would be that of the ranters and the levellers of the English Civil War in the 17th century, whose slogan was, turn the world upside down. Put the interests of the majority, of the millions in charge, not the tiny millionaires. And that's what socialism is all about.
Thank you very much, Neil.